Welcome to Archaeology Books for Fun, reading books that aren't drier than dirt. I'm your host, Tristan Herrenstein, and with me as always is my co-host, Barbara Clark.
Hello, hello, everybody.
And today we are starting up a brand new book titled The Lost City of the Monkey God, A True Story by Douglas Preston. So we're looking forward to jumping into that. Before we do, we have our usual little bit of housekeeping. If you are listening to this as a podcast, please give us a review. And if you're watching this on YouTube or Spotify, please like, subscribe, leave us a comment. Also, share the word. If you enjoy this, share it on your socials. If you have friends and family that you think would like this as well, please send it their way. Also, if you would like to support FPAN and what we do, please check out the donate link in the description. We are a not-for-profit program, and any support we get can help us an awful lot with our mission of bringing history and archaeology to people and talking about these issues that we talk about in this podcast. So, The Lost City of the Monkey God. I will say that when we get our book suggestions or we've come across a book, we haven't read these books before.
Correct.
And so this one is going to be a little bit of a departure, we think, from what we have done before. Now, we have read the book titled Four Lost Cities, and despite the title, the whole premise of the book was that these cities were not actually lost. So it is actually a very concrete and very well-developed idea that the author had throughout that book, I would say.
Yeah, I agree.
So I didn't necessarily assume anything with this book, with the phrasing of lost in the title. However, it seems like this book kind of, you could say, maybe might go the other way.
Yeah, you and I have discovered there is some controversy surrounding this book, and also I think the title itself of this book.
Right.
We'll get into that in multiple episodes of this podcast, I'm sure.
Yes. Just for our listeners, if you want, I stumbled across a blog post reviewing the book, and it had some major critiques of it. Now, I'm not going to go over it point by point here because I think we'll cover a lot of this throughout reading the book over the next few episodes. However, I wanted to point out a couple of the major critiques of this book through this blog post in particular. First of all is indigenous erasure. And so this is essentially, the critique is that they are doing this discovering and this recording, but they are not talking about the local native history or heritage and not including them necessarily in the process.
Which I think is something both you and I noticed even before you sent me that article too.
Yes. And then another critique is, he titled it Academic Unseriousness. And so essentially the idea is that his take is that if you are writing about this sort of thing, you don't have to write an academic article, but you should be taking some of this seriously and backing up some of your claims with actual sources and helping us understand where some of these things come from. And at least understanding these sources yourself, I think, is kind of the gist of that claim.
Yeah. And I do wonder, obviously in this book, he does some background research.
Yes.
But what it focuses on is not what we would like to see it focus on, I guess you can say.
When we found this article, I thought, oh, this is interesting, maybe a little alarming. Let's just kind of see how it goes, see if we agree with the blog post or not. And I think based off of initial observations we've made is that the blog post may have actually not talked about a lot of the issues we're seeing as well, too.
Yeah. And I was kind of the same way. I read the article you sent and I had gotten in through like the first couple chapters. What he had mentioned, I kind of noticed, but I was like, oh, we're early. Keep in mind, we're only reading the first third of this book for this episode. But
yeah,
the article discusses the entire book as a whole. So it discusses things that you and I haven't read yet. And looking at what we've read thus far,
and so I thought maybe it's being a little overcritical. Maybe we'll disagree with some of this. So I will actually link this article in the description for this episode and maybe all of them even. And I encourage everyone to give this article a read because I think it's very well put together as far as this person's thoughts on the book. And let us know what you think. Do you think if there's merit to this, especially if you're reading the book along with us, let us know your opinions nicely. You can disagree with us even. We're okay with that, but we would like to hear everyone's thoughts on this because there's a lot of kind of complicated issues as touched on, and I'm sure there's differing opinions on a lot of this too.
Yeah, I would welcome constructive dialogue.
Yeah,
definitely.
And so for those who are listening to this, if you haven't already listened to the book Stealing History, or the episodes we did on that book, I would highly recommend you go back and listen to that first, because we're actually, I think, going to be referencing that book in particular an awful lot, because it stands in contrast to this one quite a bit.
Agreed.
So did you want to go into the kind of the synopsis?
Sure. This book it takes place in Honduras in a region called Mesquitia, which is a very dense rainforest. And there is a legend of, and I use the word lost very loosely, lost city, and it goes by various names: Ciudad Blanca, City of the Monkey God, City of the Jaguar, and it is a early civilization, the remains of an early civilization.
Or the legend of.
Yeah, and according to this book, they don't know who occupied this civilization. There's a long history of exploration to find the ruins of this city, and he goes through all the different, I guess, for lack of a better word, explorers. Of course, they're all white male.
Right.
So they are trying to find this lost city using at the time, new technology called LiDAR. And we can go into detail later when we discuss it, because there's a whole chapter on it. And it's Douglas Preston's written account, I guess, of this expedition. There was a documentary made of it as well, so he talks a little bit about that process as well.
And the LiDAR is one of the reasons it caught our attention, because I have heard of some really impressive work with LiDAR in the region. I wasn't aware of this specific project, but yeah.
Yeah, same. I was really interested in LiDAR because I had heard that it has been very, very useful in areas with dense tree cover and things. So the Honduran rainforest is perfect environment for that.
Right. So the first chapter, I'd say, is kind of some scene setting, and it kind of skips ahead in the timeline a bit. I've seen this done in other books too. It sets up the Mesquitia region as vast, lawless, densely packed, full of deadly things. And it's kind of, oh yeah, lots of cocaine and murders and drugs. I wasn't convinced there's a problem at this point, but now, having read a third of the book, I can see this is the setting of think of kind of old style adventure stories. I mean, Indiana Jones probably is honestly not a bad comparison, because Indiana Jones is built off of this kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah.
And
just the adventure kind of, no research question.
No. Well, but it's also, I think one of the articles we've read in preparation for this, I think said it very well. It sets up Honduras as the setting rather than one of the main characters.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think that's one of the initial and kind of overarching problems I had with it, because this should be largely about Honduras and the history in the area, but it's about an adventure.
Yeah.
And that's not necessarily the end of the world, but it does lend towards this old pattern, I think, of European descended men talking about or exploring think of like the uncharted areas of Africa and think of Lovecraftian era stuff almost. And think about, there were people living there in these areas where they were talking about, but they're talking about them like it's such a strange and fascinating and otherworldly place. When it's like, no, it's people.
It's so dangerous that there's, it makes it seem like it's so dangerous people could just absolutely not live there.
Right.
When in fact, there are people that have been inhabiting that area for thousands of years continuously.
Yeah.
And I think it also, I've never been to Honduras, but it doesn't paint the country in a good light as far as the people and the environment and the climate, when it makes it feel like narco trafficking and all this bad stuff is all there is to Honduras. But at the same time, if that's the case, then why are you going in search of this like phenomenal lost civilization? You know what I'm saying? So it's... Well,
and at this point in the story, I could forgive this approach if this is where he just started and he's like, no, actually,
right. That would be amazing.
That would be really, that's what I was hoping to get from this.
Yeah.
But it's so far, my impression is that's not what we get. One thing, I went down a little bit of a rabbit hole on this, because before their expedition, they're getting a
Safety
talking to,
briefing.
but he's talking about the fer-de-lance
Yeah.
snake. And it has all this description about how vicious and terrible it is, how it bites above the knee. And I'm like, I've worked in the field in Americas, and I've heard kind of similar stories even about rattlesnakes. Like, I was in Colorado, and they were telling us stories about crotch-biting rattlers, which isn't a thing.
Here in Florida, it's the water moccasin.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I looked into this a bit, just curious. And to be fair, the author isn't necessarily presenting this whole thing as fact, because after all of this, he says clearly they were trying to alarm us and make us very cautious. But I still found it very interesting, and it's actually important context for some of the tone of the book, I think, because the fer-de-lance actually is unpredictable, and it can bite above the knee, which is a problem because most of the snake guards go to the knee, and it can be very dangerous. But actually, in the last 70 years, the death rate's been near zero for this snake because they've developed antivenom for it.
Yeah.
So it's not nice, and it is alarming. It isn't like it's presented in this story either, where they like human habitation, and so they come after us. Like, no, their habitats are overlapping with ours, is a big part of the problem. And then they don't come after people, but they can turn around and go after someone pretty quickly. They don't like chase you down, though. Like, again, that's another water moccasin story, isn't it? That is not true.
Yeah.
So that's why I was like, this sounds fishy. So it turned out it is based on there's some fact in there, but it's not near like the terrifying nonsense it suggests it is. I did like the mention of bullet ants, though.
I thought you would like that.
I'm always
Tristan.
happy to hear about ants. I was curious about the red ants. I was trying to figure out what those would be. It said red ants in the brush that will fall on you, and it will I think it was cause a reaction that'll have to take you to the hospital right away or something.
Oh, yeah.
And I couldn't find any indication of any ant that deadly in the area. I'm sure they've got fire ants, but unless you have an allergic reaction, that's not going to cause anything that alarming. Just be very, very unpleasant. So I don't know. Also, thorns that can draw blood with that's thorns.
Right. I was like, okay, that sounds like Florida.
Yeah, I thought I actually had the same comment in there. Yeah. So I was having fun kind of at this point because, like I said, this isn't really set up to be what the author's saying the place is necessarily.
Was interesting to me, and even before reading the article that you sent me, but I was like, okay, so they hired this ex-military guy who was from the British military, and I guess he had some experience in South and Central America and stuff. I was like, why didn't you just hire a local guy who maybe hunted? Hire a local. Why would you not hire someone who's...
Or even if you need this guy to lead, hire
a couple
teammates that are... Yeah, because I'm sure Honduras has ex-military people that you can...
Yeah.
Anyway.
So that just struck me as odd. I didn't understand
Based on the narrative in the book that we get to, I would have a sense that they assumed they couldn't trust anyone from Honduras.
Which is
kind of
troubling.
Yeah. At this point, especially, I didn't have the context to say definitely that's a problem, but it's flags, right?
Yeah. I mean, because when we do archaeology here in Florida, and I assume other states are similar, when we're filling out the Florida Master Site File form for an individual site, one of the last questions it asks is, who was your local informant? What did they tell you? I mean, it's just basic archaeology at this point,
right?
To talk to the locals.
Well, I meant for the security, but that's a separate issue.
Yeah.
We'll get to that one, I think, a little later.
Yeah.
So like I said, that first chapter, just kind of introduction, get us started. We ready for chapter 2, or do you have any more on that one?
Yeah, I mean, it was just kind of setting up the foundation, I guess.
Like we said, I wasn't too alarmed yet. So chapter 2 starts talking about NASA and satellite imagery and how it's been used to identify archaeological sites in Cambodia in this case. And do I have that right? Is that how this starts?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
It doesn't seem to fit quite. And so he talked to the guy who was a team leader of this project, Ron Blom.
Yeah, I said
Blom, which I already had a bit of a reaction here because apparently during the interview he wore Indiana Jones hat.
I know. I heard that and I was like, oh goodness, he's one of those.
Yeah. And so he's mapping old trails, which honestly is probably one of the cooler things you could be doing, I think, with this technology.
Right, yeah.
And that it was a bit telling, too, that the author wasn't interested in trails.
I thought that was weird, too, because old trails are going to be where you find...
That's true as well.
The archaeological sites and stuff.
Yeah, for folks at home are wondering, like, what's the big deal with old trails? The trade networks, the traveling to and from places that happen along these old roads is a big part of understanding the ancient world and how it operated.
And we even see that a little bit in Lost Cities. Really?
Yeah. Actually, Lost Cities does a nice job of some of that, I would say.
Yeah.
He's got a bunch of projects he's working on, and the author is interested in the Lost City stuff. And so the author uses, this is interesting, because this is where I was like, well, maybe the blog is being overdramatic a lot of the time, because the author tends to use the term Lost City when it's someone else's words, but when it's the author's words, he usually references it as ruins.
I noticed that too, and I know you and I texted about that, I think around the time you sent me that article.
Yeah.
But I kind of stopped taking tally of that once I got further into this section.
I got distracted by other things.
Yeah.
That's true. But this is when I was like, okay, maybe this is a little overstated. You know, so I tried to give it a chance. It's kind of what I'm trying to communicate here. When it comes to the Lost City, though, the NASA director becomes kind of evasive and doesn't want to talk about that very much. And eventually it comes out, he's doing this on the side for a private party, and he's not allowed to really talk about it. And that's when I was like, are you allowed to?
I wondered that too. And also,
like, I think it's public data, but it's also, I think, potentially, if you're the director, it's very much a potential conflict of interest.
Yeah. And I also don't know, like, you know, we don't know the details of any contracts and payments and stuff like that.
And maybe it was on the up and up.
Yeah.
But the way it's presented here, I don't know that. And It's not questioned. That's part of the issue, too.
The fact that so many times in this book, this project was kind of kept secret and people were hesitant to talk about it. As a public archaeologist, that's like a red flag to me. But also, I know I have that public archaeology mindset where I want everything to be public to everybody. And I guess in some cases, I can see that being as naive depending on certain circumstances. But
security and other
and
levels
safety of your staff
problems,
and things like that, especially like looking at stealing history.
Right.
But to me, in an ideal world, everything would be public, you know?
So I thought that was odd that he was doing this project for a private individual on the side using his data from work. Like we said, I don't know about details on that. Just like there's a couple of moments here where I'm like, I feel like certain government people involved should have had some questions, or frankly, the author should have clarified this for us a little better.
That's my thing. Yeah. There's oftentimes in this book, I feel like as I'm reading it, I have questions and I'm like, oh, maybe they'll come back to that. Or
yeah, because at this point, the author should have said, oh, this struck me as a little odd. I looked into it and no, he was fully on the up and up and it's allowed by these regulations. Or it'd be like a sentence or two would have clarified that for me nicely.
Well, and especially considering the author is a journalist, I feel like that's just basic journalism.
Yeah. The author starts investigating and gets in touch with a few people, starts hearing stories here and there. I think he starts to get, he doesn't hear about Ciudad Blanca yet. Eventually, Ron Blum's employer does contact him, and this is Steve Elkins.
Yes.
And this is a name we'll be seeing throughout the book, as far as I'm aware so far.
So far, yeah.
And so essentially, this is a very wealthy man who has taken upon himself to discover lost city legends, or investigate them at least, I guess you could say. And this is interesting because he talks about a potential site he has for the Ciudad Blanca, and he won't say where it is because the data could be used by anybody. That's, I think, legit. But he didn't want someone to grab the credit. And as an afterthought in the book and in the reported conversation, and people might loot it. Like, that's a flag right there, that that's not your first concern.
Yeah, I noticed that too. And
credit is the biggest concern.
Right, which I would say it's like that academic ivory tower, but he's not really an academic, so I don't know.
It's got that looter mindset almost, it feels like, a lot of the times.
It's mine, not yours.
Yeah, that's about the thing.
Yep.
And that's actually,
I did note that there's a mention of Gordon Willey, who is a renowned archaeologist. He's done a lot of work here in Florida, and I didn't realize that he was at Harvard, he was considered a Mayanist.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. Did you know that?
I don't think I'd heard that exact term before even.
Oh, okay.
I mean, it makes sense, but I've always just thought archaeology specializes in Mayan.
I just know he did a lot of work in Florida, and having done most of my work in Florida, in my mind, he was like a Florida archaeologist, and that's what he specialized in. So it was really interesting. I saw his name and I was like, wait, what?
Yeah. So in chapter 3, we start talking about the historic record of the investigation into the site, or the Ciudad Blanca, and how it kind of developed as a legend, I would say, too. And so essentially there are some written records from Spaniards who came across some city, but they couldn't find it, or I think one of them died too soon after reporting about it.
Yeah.
These are actual records, but that's kind of your typical legend fare, frankly.
It's a great start to a legend, essentially.
It is a good way of laying out how the legend became what it is.
Yeah.
I don't mind that.
I did for this chapter, I put in summary, old dead white guy's chronology.
Yeah.
Just because it's like all these.
Yeah. It's like this guy reported this, and this guy reported that. And we don't even know if it's always the same thing they're seeing.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I was wondering is, like, there seemed to be multiple reports pertaining to potentially different places, but all thinking it was the same site.
Or it was interpreted that way by people who are looking to legend. Yeah,
right.
Because there can only be one big city in the area, I guess, is kind of where it's coming from.
Yeah.
One thing that stood out to me, and this does seem to be a potential trend of the book, is the author goes on a little kind of side tangent about the word civilization and mentions how archaeologists don't like to use that word because it implies one culture is better than another. And so he said that typically people will use the term culture instead of civilization to talk about a group of people. But he says it's easier to say civilization, so I'm going to say it, and we're just going to assume that I don't have much judgment tied to the word civilization. And or you could just use culture.
Right.
You just use the word you said you should probably be using. There's no reason to not use that word. It's even shorter.
Right.
So it's so weird to me. One thing I am enjoying about this book in particular is it has a fair amount of overlap with concepts we've covered in other books. And we've mentioned this a little bit already, but he does a little bit talking about how one person, John Lloyd Stevens, guy got himself appointed as ambassador so he could kind of snoop around in the area. And essentially, though, he found, from his perspective, we want to make that clear, signs of ancient civilization, ancient culture that supposedly completely changed North Americans' view on what Native Americans were capable of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And
okay,
I thought that was interesting because we've talked about this through Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries particularly, about how there was a period where it was assumed, mostly for their convenience, that Native Americans were incapable of doing any monumental structure. It must have been someone else.
Right.
In North America, this was the mounds. And, everyone said, oh, it's Atlantis or the Lost Tribe of Israel instead of
everybody but who built it.
And so the author presents this discovery in this area as settling that debate. And I checked the dates on that, on what we covered in Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries, and it definitely didn't settle that debate, but it did come in that time when they were figuring this out. So this discovery, quote unquote discovery, was in 1839. And we talked about Squire and Davis, the first pass at recording the mounds in North America. That was in 1845 to 1847. And then the thing that Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries presented as finally settling the debate was Cyrus Thomas's report in 1890. So definitely didn't settle that, but I could also see a distinction between, I could definitely see, actually there was mentioned Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries too, the assumption that Native Americans in North America had pushed out the monument makers to Central and South America. So I could see that being settling Central America, but people still find excuses for North America to not be. So,
yeah.
Anyway, I just thought it tied in an interesting way. Also, this will sound familiar to people who've listened to our talk about stealing history. He bought the ruins from the locals for $50.
Copan, right? Or Copan, I think it was. He bought the ruins of Copan.
Yes. And he planned to disassemble the buildings and relocate them to North America.
Which I had to read that twice. because
we've read about this happening before, though.
yeah.
Because this happened, this was Thomas Bruce around 1800, did this in Greece, was it? I think it was Greece, and then disassembled some ruins in Greece and shipped them to England.
Yeah.
He actually did that, though. In this case, he abandoned that idea, but that's interesting. I wonder even if this guy was influenced by that previous endeavor, because if he's into this stuff, his chances he heard of that, and it would have been about 30 or 40 years before. Anyway, there's some interesting tie-ins with what we've talked about before. Anyway, they're writing thrilling books. You know, again, this is the adventure story stuff. There was once more a tie-in to Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries, where the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints sent expeditions to the Maya area to try and prove that the Maya were a lost tribe of Israel.
Yes.
And that turned into a big drama where archaeologists got excommunicated because they didn't agree.
Well, I mean, we also learned that we were on the list of
the deceivers.
Yes. Yeah, so that tracks.
Here's a quote from the book. Archaeologists today don't like the word civilization because it implies superiority, preferring the term culture. I will, however, continue to use the word civilization with the understanding that no such value judgment is meant. It is merely a term for a culture that is complex and widespread. There's no need to do that.
Yeah, just use culture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or, frankly, could have almost kept using civilization. He probably wouldn't have gotten too much flack over that.
No, I don't think I have never had a hot debate over using culture or civilization.
Right, especially in a book like this, which is meant for public consumption. Yeah. Now that he brought it up, it's just obvious that he's making an intentional decision to not.
Yeah.
Which is weird.
Yeah.
There was some Smithsonian work in there. Actually, this was one of the better ones, wasn't it? Smithsonian Bureau of American Ethnology in the 1930s sent an archaeologist there, which is already a step above almost everything else going on that we're hearing about.
Yeah, that was interesting. I think this is the one where they created an illustrated journal.
I don't remember that.
Oh, yeah, they created some type of illustrated journal, which I don't know. They don't say what happened to it in the book, but I'd be curious. It's maybe at the Smithsonian still.
Seems likely anyway.
But I do like that the guy they sent down there had his finger shot off. Yeah. Possibly by him.
By himself, yeah. We're unclear on how that happened.
I know, I'm like, how does that happen?
One of the outtakes of this expedition, though, was he very clearly established this was not Mayan.
Right, yes.
Which is important.
Yes.
That's actually some good results and raised questions that I think most of them were pretty obvious questions to ask, but I thought it was pretty good to see questions and
critical analysis.
I was trying to think of like methodical thought put into it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's all I've got for that one. Like Barbara said, it's a long list of
old dead white
guys talking about I saw a thing. Being a little dismissive, but it was fine for what it was at this point.
Yeah. I mean, it does provide a little bit of context about the previous explorations of the area.
Yeah, and how the legend developed. I didn't mind it for that at all.
Yeah.
Moving on to chapter 4. This is where we start to see some tendencies in the book that are starting to get on my nerves as a reader, not as a professional.
Yeah.
So we start with George Gustav Hay, who was one of the first wealthy men trying to investigate the area.
Rich oil dude.
Yeah. And it seems like an awful lot of the white men who need to be talked about, we need their pedigree.
Yes.
We need to know
who their grandpa was and what their grandpa did and where they came from. And
right. And I could see, in theory, sometimes that might be important.
If it's relevant.
Yes. But every time I'm reading this, I'm like, why are we reading this?
Yeah. It seems distracting to me as a reader.
I don't need to know how the wealthy guy became wealthy.
Right.
That doesn't matter to me.
Yeah, I agree. It was annoying.
So as a reader, I'm getting annoyed with that. It doesn't do it every time, but it's often enough we've noticed.
And it can be like several paragraphs.
Yeah.
Like, I'm like, okay. And to me, it's enough that it becomes a tangent.
Right.
And then you have to bring yourself back into the story.
So this guy started in 1897 collecting Native American things, which 1897, that's kind of what you do.
Especially rich old white dudes.
Right. He established a museum.
Yeah, Museum of the American Indian, which was in New York City.
Yep. And that has now the collection's been moved to the Smithsonian now, which, in 1990 that happened, I guess.
Yeah, I guess then his entire museum shut down and was moved there.
Most of these guys also get a description, which doesn't necessarily matter either, but I liked this one because if anyone knows of the Spider-Man or Daredevil Kingpin character, that felt like the description we were getting here. He felt like the Kingpin.
Yes.
Which is just funny to me. So eventually he becomes interested in Mosquitia, right?
Yes, because of an armadillo sculpture, I believe, that he found in New Orleans.
Yeah, I think you're right on that. And he gets in touch with kind of a series of people saying that they have either been there or want to go and find it for him.
Yeah.
And this actually, I feel like, gets us into a trend that is potentially also a little telling, because basically everybody this guy hired was frauding him.
Yes. Okay. You're right. Yeah. There was a lot of fraud. I mean, I guess I shouldn't be surprised based on our last book.
Right.
I guess I just didn't see it coming. I was like, oh.
It was surprising me how consistent it was. Like the first one, it became clear he was defrauding him and he dumped him. They hired another guy. I don't remember the exact sequence, but one person, it became clear they actually weren't looking for the site at all. They're looking for gold.
I know. Like blatantly, they even had a journal where they talked about, no, we're not going there.
Yeah, I think that's the next chapter. But I think unless you want something you really want to talk about here, we can keep on with that conversation.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I think I'm pretty good with this section.
Okay.
I want to talk about that.
Yeah. It's so weird.
Yeah.
But, well, first of all, the fact that, now, having done grants and done projects funded through grants, I can see why they ask for so many details and like qualifications of all the people that are working on the project and stuff, because apparently back in the day,
it was just
rich people were just financing these guys without doing any background checks, and they would just go out and do whatever they wanted.
Yeah.
It's weird.
Yeah, so the main one, the one that the book goes on for a while, is kind of fascinating how this worked, because they did a couple expeditions and they couldn't keep going back because of World War II.
Right.
But they have recorded accounts where they're like interviewed for various things and give a very detailed descriptions of the city they found, which I was already like, what? Because he said, like, we only got to spend a little time with it. It was all covered in jungle, but it was 2,000 years old. Like,
right.
You could spend a career almost figuring that out.
Yeah, a couple red flags.
Yeah, there's just too much detail.
But also, what they were bringing back, I was always wondering, it didn't seem like profound enough to kind of jive with the story they were telling. But also, I understand you're traveling, you might just grab like a little something to be like, this is what there is,
Which is kind of what they did.
Yeah,
we found out.
Kind of.
Yeah, kind of.
But also...
Well, importantly, when they came back, they never told anybody the location of the site.
Right.
Even their employer.
Which... I'm like, the person who was funding this didn't think to be like, no, guys.
Absolutely not.
You have to tell me where this is or the money's getting yanked and you guys are off the project. Duh.
Another big red flag was everything they brought back was donated except for the journals. The journals stayed with the family.
Journals were suspicious. Well, and like...
People got into this.
Yeah, well, because his account was like, we found this city of gold, silver, platinum, and there was just platinum in this river, and we found a monkey deity mask, which they didn't bring back, right. And I'm like, I'd have questions.
And his walking stick had numbers carved in it, which was you can see how the people like trying to figure out the legend is like could really eat that stuff up.
And I don't know, like, during World War II, he became a spy and all this
supposedly,
stuff. Yeah.
Right?
Like this whole...
He was supposedly on a plot to kill Hitler even.
Yes, which I'm like...
I mean, with a more trustworthy person, I could buy it. But here's the thing, too, like contrasting this writing with Stealing History. Because in Stealing History, he would present people's words pretty much as they say without like his own comment. And then he would comment on it or like say, I don't have a lot of faith in some of these stories.
Right.
I can get hints of maybe doubting, but he doesn't really like ever discuss, is this a reliable source at all?
To me, this almost comes off as either like your old uncle telling a story around the dinner table at Thanksgiving, or like the guy you see at the bar just telling a story. It doesn't really have it's just for entertainment purpose, and he's getting caught up in the ooh and ah of it rather than questioning it and looking at it with a more analytical
Right.
eye.
Which, again, to be fair, there is a place for that kind of thing.
Right.
But a journalist talking about an academic and supposedly academic endeavor, I would expect a little more, even for a entertaining book, right?
Yeah, I mean, you can say like, wow, that's quite a story.
Yeah.
Here's what I think about what was said. Like, that's, I think, warranted, especially in this case. Especially, I mean,
especially when you're presenting what we find out later are probably lies.
Right.
Or at least a lot of lies.
Yeah. I mean, he was a scammer.
Yeah. And so I love how this kind of came about, though, because the author was actually key into figuring this out.
Yes, that is true. You're right. That is true.
He found out that the journals were in the hands of a descendant, and at one point they were on loan to the National Geographic. And a more recent attempt to go down there and check out the area had looked through them, but like disappointed, oh, it doesn't say anything useful. Well, the author went through these journals with a more detailed reading of what's actually happening. And he's like, oh, they're packing gold mining equipment and they're talking about gold locations. And it's like they weren't looking for this thing ever. Like there's like a couple little side note and then a mention at the end of like scrambling together some artifacts that they could take back. Like that's kind of fascinating.
Well, and I believe some portions of the journal went missing.
Not quite.
Okay.
I love this too.
Okay.
Because he talks to a guy who's like deep into like this stuff and been studying this for a while. And apparently the descendant had been sending him pieces of the journal saying there were parts missing.
Yeah.
Whereas the author went through the journal is like, no, every day is accounted for. There's nothing missing. And he sent copies to this person who studies and like, he's like, oh my gosh, I've been scammed this whole time. Not only by the guy who did the journal originally, but by the descendant too.
Yeah.
And I like too his thought that how the journals got leaked may have been because the descendant was actually in prison and his wife may have loaned them out not knowing she shouldn't.
Right.
Which is also kind of amazing.
Yeah.
So it's actually a pretty entertaining story. I enjoyed this quite a bit and I appreciated his digging into it and looking at this critically, frankly, even though we had some spots we would have liked a little more, but he got into this and I liked it a lot.
No, and I think that was one of the more like stand-up moments.
Yeah,
like,
so far anyway.
Very like that's, to me, that's exactly why you want a journalist on the case.
Right.
They're going to dig deep, right?
Yeah, and he followed up with contacts. And yeah, like this is really pretty good right here. And that's when I had maybe a little more hope.
Right.
But yeah, this was a fun chapter. I enjoyed this one a lot.
Yeah.
So the first part of this chapter, you can let me know if anything stood out to you, but this was a whole big section where I was like, we did find out Steve Elkins heard about Ciudad Blanca first from Steve Morgan.
Yeah, which I guess he was a
marine salvage.
Yeah.
Which for listeners at home, that just means they were maneuvering around legal stuff to be able to loot shipwrecks.
Yeah.
This is a big point of contention in Florida in particular.
Yes.
And we have a lot of peers that would be, I think, very angry to even see this name and probably know this name.
It wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, that's yet another flag, right? But that just seems to be kind of the thing. Like Steve Elkins seems to be kind of surrounding himself with people, and a fair number of them seem to be looting or have looted.
Yeah, they're all
kind
of shady.
Yeah,
but
it's just kind of iffy. Yeah,
I think this is where we first learn Bruce. I'm pronouncing his name Heineke. I don't know if that's correct or not. And they kind of call him like the logistics guy. He's the fixer. To me, he's kind of a bully.
Here's another case of where the author seems to take things at face value, and I feel like he should be questioning more. His previous endeavors were gold prospector, drug smuggler, treasure hunter, and archaeological looter.
Right.
But later on, the author talks about all the stories he tells and just records them and presents them at face value without ever he tells a lot of big tales.
Yeah,
I don't know what to take here as serious or not. That's what I would expect to hear.
And his wife is Honduran. And
Heineke's wife. Yes.
Yeah, Heineke's wife is Honduran. And so he's worked a lot in his various professions. I don't know. Down in Honduras. So he's familiar with the area. He, I believe, speaks the language, but I'm not 100% certain.
I think he does.
And the way it's put in the book is he knows the ways down there, and he knows how to manipulate and bribe people or bribe the locals, and he knows his way around the bureaucracy. And it even says like he knows how to threaten and intimidate and deal with the criminals in the area.
And it's presented in a way that's almost
glorified.
Admiring.
Yeah.
And it's kind of gross. I do not like this person.
I was just like, why? In my mind, if you are trying to do like any sort of legitimate study of an area, this is the last guy you want on your team.
Or if he was on the team, I would be like, keep him away from me.
Yeah. Because I for example, one of the many stories told about Heineke, and there's more throughout the book, it seems, but there was a situation where the German producer needed to get on a plane, and it was like the last flight out, and the plane was full, and Heineke supposedly gets on the plane. He asks who was the last person to board the plane, and when he finds that person, he points a gun at him and orders him off of the plane. And then is like, okay, producer guy, here's your seat.
And it's presented as like, oh, he's so quirky.
Yeah, Elkins says that it's like, I had to dance with the devil at times. And saying like, in order to get things done, sometimes you need Heineke to do something that
you wouldn't do yourself. But
right.
Like, well, that you hired him, that makes it not better.
Yeah. And I just, it's so ick. And
I do not like that person.
Well, to me, at any amount, however little it is, of legitimacy regarding this project,
it erodes at least.
Yes, is really, really put into question when you have somebody like this helping you get things done. Because it may take longer to go through the bureaucratic ways, or he might have to wait until the next day to get a plane ticket.
It was like a business emergency.
Yeah.
It wasn't like my father's on the deathbed, which even then,
it's sad.
It's not worth threatening another person's life over.
Right. Yeah.
So then we move on to Elkins's family history, which I didn't make any note of other than Elkins's family history, because I don't find that relevant. We do go on his personal history, which there were some relevant notes. In particular, he got started in archaeology, with air quotes, on a camping trip where he looted a burial site.
Yes.
He took it to the university, who set it up in excavation. The book, I looked, because it doesn't say exactly when this was. Right. And that would be important context, but it's still not great.
Right. I guess when it would be very important in this case, because to me, if you're a professor, at least nowadays, and a student comes to you with a skull, you're like, whoa.
Yeah.
Federal laws here, and
the same rules would apply probably if you found the site on an excavation. First thing you do is call law enforcement, because it could be a murder.
Yeah.
For all you know.
It was just, the professor was just like, oh wow, that's interesting. Let's do an excavation
the way it's presented
there.
Here, right?
Right. Yeah.
But they went out and did an excavation of the burial site,
which is weird.
Yeah. Definitely not to our standards today, but I know that thing did happen. But we've talked about before how we kind of feel about that sort of thing. So Elkins has decided he needs to be more methodical with his approach now, rather than just going to wandering around in the jungle. And like we've talked about, apparently not talking to anyone who lives there. So he starts with historic research, and, props to him for doing what seems like very thorough historic research. It's hard to tell from this narrative exactly what we would think of that if we actually read it, but
Right. I mean, I don't know what even is actually available as far as documentation of this area.
He does consult with a person named Stan Glassmeyer.
Yeah, he's a geologist, I believe.
Yes, but it's quoted, a solid, respectable scientist with a surprisingly credible story, and in his living room were impressive stone sculptures he had allegedly carried out of the ruins. So he was a looter.
Yeah, see, this is and I know he's not an archaeologist, but I feel like anybody who works in a scientific field would know better. I just wonder if there's like this weird, almost like cognitive dissonance where people forget that like archaeology is a science and it's methodological and there are ethical considerations. It's very weird to me how someone who's a geologist could just be like, oh, wow, is it because they study something?
And again, the con men involved, because this guy was hired to go looking for gold and decided instead he's going to look for the ancient city.
I know, yeah. He went the opposite way of the other guy.
Yeah. But also I was like, well, that makes you trustworthy right there. Like, I should already have big flags. And then there's this whole story about him finding the city and sending everything to the University of Pennsylvania, who says they have nothing of this.
Yeah, and he even checked Penn State, I think. Like, he checked multiple universities in Pennsylvania because he thought, well, maybe he misremembered what university. And every single university was like, we have no idea what you're talking about.
And it just seems like everyone involved with this keeps surrounding themselves with such apparent con men.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know 100% that his tale isn't true, but you should very much be doubting this right now. And again, the book doesn't doubt this really either.
No, it almost, it glorifies it in some ways.
Yeah.
Like, it's like, oh, this is such a cool story.
Right.
And multiple
look
times,
at what he did and accomplished. And,
yeah, like multiple times throughout the book, especially when it comes to like Heineke, you know, oh, wow, what a cool story.
well, and his daughter says that he sent it in. Like, well, that doesn't help add credibility to his story, really.
Right. Yeah.
It's so weird. So the second aspect, though, is space tech. And this is where Ron Blum comes in and he's working for him. So they're starting with satellite imagery. And this is in the 90s?
Yes.
So they identify a few potential locations from the satellite imagery, but the satellite imagery is poor enough that it's not a done deal by any means.
And I thought the description of radar technology at the time was kind of interesting because, I mean, the whole reason I was really interested in this book was because of LiDAR.
Right.
And so every chapter I'm like, when are we going to start talking about the tech, you know? And so when we finally got to this, it was like, yay, technology talk. But just some of the details about how radar works, how infrared and visual wavelengths of light are, it's very basic, like it's not in depth. But I was
still okay.
Yeah, and I was just excited to see some of it finally emerging. Yeah.
But kind of the takeaway, I think, was they can't say anything conclusive from this tech. It just gives them an idea of where to go, which is how a lot of that tech actually works in real life.
Yeah.
Ground penetrating radar, that kind of thing. It's actually how it works. And then the chapter ends. In the end, it was a gut feeling Elkins had about T1, Target 1.
Yeah.
I just thought that if I were a king, this would be the perfect place to hide my kingdom.
Which...
unlike if you were an expert in like city placement and like why cultures do different cities in different locations, that would have some weight. But your gut feeling on how that should work based on fantasy has zero weight.
If I was a king, this is where I would hide my kingdom. This puts into my mind like the idea that the leader of whatever culture this was like, oh yes, when it becomes ruins one day, I don't want anybody to find it. We're going to create this cool legend about our culture and civilization. That's not how people work.
It's not how cultures work.
Right.
They were not isolated. They traded, and you'd want people to find your city because that's where the trade comes from.
Yeah. And
that's where a lot of the wealth comes from, even back.
Yeah. It was just like that thought process to me was very elitist isn't the right word, but just...
Well, I feel like he's basing that idea off of a fantasy idea of how culture, like cities work.
Yeah.
Like it's planned. Most of them aren't planned. They just happen because it's a good spot.
Right.
Every once in a while, there will be one that's a ruler says we're going to build one here. Most of them are just
defensible and
yeah. And even when a ruler says we're going to build one here, it's usually an existing thing. We're going to build this place up, and this is going to be the city.
Yeah.
So it's
somebody needs to read Lost Cities.
Well, adding this doesn't add any weight to the idea that he's onto something.
Yeah.
It actually undermines the whole project and book.
Yeah. Your spidey sense means nothing.
Yeah. Yeah. Your Ludi sense means nothing.
Ludi sense.
So, yeah, buckle in, folks, because it only gets more interesting from here.
Yes. So, chapter 7 is interesting, I guess.
Yeah. Well, it begins with what happens to the first attempt at an expedition, right?
Yeah. And I mean, I was happy to see there was at least mention of getting permits. I was starting to wonder, like, but then again, as we read later on, there's issues with that. But this talks about...
Well, before we do that, though, the first expedition was canceled.
Oh, yes.
Because of a hurricane that hit Honduras, which is actually timely because we may have a hurricane here coming this week.
Yeah, we both had to cancel programs this week.
Well, I haven't canceled one yet, but we'll see. I'm going to talk to them and see what they want to do. But yeah. So, yeah, this was sounded like a pretty darn bad hurricane for Honduras.
Yeah.
And it was bad enough that they canceled their expedition.
Yeah, like very bad landslides and floods and economic issues.
And it's not a bad segue into talking a little bit about Honduras' situation.
Yeah.
It wasn't a bad segue for that. I will give him a lot of props for that.
Yeah. I think it was important. But again, going back to having read Stealing History, I don't think he made the connections between, well, the indigenous people were pretty much non-existent in this book as of right now. But there was a lot of connections, I think, that could be made. He talked about the economy as it pertains to this expedition more so than anything else, I felt.
I would expand on that a little more because there's so much about the banana industry. Is that this one?
Yes. Yeah. The banana history, the banana republics, Samuel Z. Murray, I guess is how you would say that, who was Sam the Banana Man.
Right.
And so I guess that does talk about
Well, so just for people listening for context, the banana apparently was so lucrative that various American corporations and wealthy individuals intentionally kept Honduras poor and unstable to take advantage of it.
Yeah.
It's kind of what the whole thing comes down to.
I will say I had no idea that when the banana came to North America, it was so popular that there was like this banana frenzy. They couldn't really keep bananas on the shelves.
Right.
I had no idea. I mean, bananas are great, but wow. Yeah. I mean, it was a lot of taking advantage of Honduras and Hondurans.
Yeah. But here's kind of highlighting our issue again, is most of this history is kind of to explain why Honduras, the situation it's in now. But this section's about the wealthy white men still.
Yeah.
It's not about Honduras.
Yes.
Honduras is a secondary character in its own story.
Yeah.
It's kind of what's going on here. I even made note of that. Stories of the bad actors are interesting, but they're given more time and detail than the country itself. It's almost like they're the main feature. And that's...
Well, to me, again, it's glorifying these guys rather than focusing on...
disgusted with them.
Yeah.
And how Honduras tried to deal with it.
Yeah. To me, I mean, just reading about this made me mad on multiple levels. One, I was mad for Honduras.
Yeah.
And two, I was mad at the chapter itself in the way it was written, I guess.
The banana situation needed to be discussed.
Definitely.
But the way it was discussed almost perpetuated the problems.
Yes. Perfectly said. Yes.
And so I didn't take a lot of notes.
I didn't either. I mean, it's interesting but when you're reading this chapter, just maybe read it with a critical lens.
Yeah, I mean, that's true for any of the books we've covered, but this book maybe a little more than others. I
think there's a lot that needed to be said that wasn't.
Yeah, or a lot that was said that didn't need to be said too.
But there was a lot of that. But he does eventually bring it back around to Hurricane Mitch and starts talking again about, I guess, Elkins eventually just kind of gave up, but he comes back into it. So
yeah, he went somewhere else for a while, I think. In the next chapter, he starts with that.
Yeah. But again, it's kind of like, the instability here caused Elkins to give up. And in addition to Honduras being a secondary character in its own story, now it's almost like the villain in this story.
It is. Yeah. It's a piece of hostile landscape.
Yes. Yeah.
It's a obstacle. It's not a country full of people.
And it's a very weird way to discuss and describe a country in which you are wanting. To me, it shows it's about the thing, not about the people. Because if you were interested in the people,
or about the prestige, as we talked about,
just to why would you be there if you considered it hostile and stuff like that? If it wasn't just to find the thing.
Yeah. Again, let's compare this briefly to Stealing History, because Stealing History, he dealt with a lot of kind of dark topics.
And hostility.
The place he starts is he is working with people who are doing the things he's studying. He's working with the looters to talk with them and get to know them. And then he goes into the story about how the site was discovered and all the drama around that. And that is not just about even Peru, it's even more about the site and Sipan. And then we get a lot of really deep dive into the culture of the people who made the site and the culture of Peru and Sipan. And yes, we do eventually go to other places when he needs to look at the other aspects of the collecting chain. But Peru is a major part of that narrative, and the culture and everything involved, and understanding the problems they're dealing with are all part of that.
Yeah, he goes into like these people are, yes, doing something illegal and yes, doing something that we would consider ethically wrong, but these are the reasons. This is the broader picture. And I just feel like that's lacking in this book.
Yeah. And it's not excusing those things either, but it helps us put into context about it's not just evil people doing evil things.
Yeah.
There are reasons this stuff happens, and there are ways it could not be happening.
Right. Like you end up empathizing with people who are doing things that are wrong.
I still don't like what they're doing.
Right. But you're like, oh, I understand their situation a little better.
Right. So, but we don't get that kind of thing through here. And to be clear, again, if we think about the context of the two different books, they're not the same in context either. Stealing History is kind of a dark book.
Yeah. And
this is clearly wanting to go more the adventure route, but it still is negligent, I would say, in how it covers some of these topics.
And I do want to point out, because I know some of the responses to the review is that, well, this book doesn't talk about that because this is not from the author.
Right.
This is from readers saying because it was written for the lay person. Well, so was Stealing History.
Right. So was Four Lost Cities. And we had critiques of those,
yes.
To be clear.
But there is a way you can include this broader context and still have it written for the lay person, is my point.
Yes, exactly. And that broader context can enrich the whole story.
Most definitely.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So 8 kind of starts off with a side quest.
I actually wrote that in my notes.
I didn't, but it just occurred to me now as looking at it. It's like, this is just a side quest. This isn't actually, yeah.
That's funny.
Honestly, I don't know that we need to go into this. Basically, went and looked for another this is a lost treasure.
Yeah, Loot of Lima is one of the various names that this goes by, and it's buried treasure that probably doesn't actually exist.
Apparently, he did team up with descendants of the people who stole the goods to try and find it. That's right. But remember, 95 times out of 100, if there's a story about lost treasure, it's nonsense.
Right. It's a story, and that's all.
Because, people generally not going to leave that stuff lying around. The only one I'm aware of that was actually true was Captain Kidd, and we covered that as our second book.
I know, and I think, Tristan, we have Bucket Day coming up.
We do. Bucket Day is coming next month.
Yeah.
Or if you're listening to this month, actually.
Right.
Yes, because we did this a little ahead. Yes. So Bucket Day, real quick for those listening, is the day that Captain Kidd hit his gunner on the head with a bucket and killed him, and that's what ultimately he was sentenced to hang for.
Yep.
For a bucket.
And it became a FPAN holiday at our office.
Yeah, so
it's on our calendar.
It's on our calendar. Yep. And that's in the first episode of the Captain Kidd one, I think. Yeah.
I think so, yeah. So go listen to it.
Yeah. So he did the side quest, didn't find it. Oh, he couldn't. I like this. He couldn't do it because what country was it in?
Peru.
Peru brings it back. Owns the islands, and I think Peru, my impression is Peru is like, no, you can't go digging around in these islands.
Which, good for you, Peru.
Good for you, Peru. And so then he finally hears about LiDAR.
I know, I was like, even in my notes I said, finally we get to see the LiDAR.
Yes. And we get a reasonable description of it.
Mm-hmm.
Basic, but it's fine for understanding kind of how it works.
Yeah.
Talks about the article that kind of made so many waves. It was in Archaeology magazine and is titled Lasers in the Jungle. It is fantastic. I highly recommend it.
Yeah. It's about, I don't know if I'm going to say this right, caracal in Belize? Caracal?
Sure. Yes, and 2 archaeologists, Alan Chase and Diane Chase, which I'd like to point out we are 8 chapters in, and that is the first woman
with a
actually
name.
Named in this book.
Yes.
If you were to play a drinking game and to take a drink every time a Honduras person is named or a woman is named, it would be the worst drinking game ever.
Yeah, you'd be sober.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's actually a cool story. They'd been working on this site, Caracal, for 25 years, and they knew they were missing a lot because they just couldn't find it all. So they did LiDAR, and in 3 days, they had a detailed map of the whole place and they think they said they had only previously recorded 13% of everything that was recovered in 3 days.
Which to me, and I know you and I had a conversation earlier at the office about...
Yeah, we couldn't resist talking about this book.
Yeah,
we usually avoid
all
that.
Day, and we texted each other about it and stuff. We usually try not to so that we have fresh conversation.
We were getting fired up, though, if you can't tell.
When I think of the use of LiDAR, this is what I think. Like, we have a site, we know it's here, but it's under thick vegetation cover, or we think we're missing things that maybe the naked eye can't see. That's when I think of using LiDAR. I have never really...
I have one other I can think of where it was a city in Egypt, I want to say, that there are records of it existing, but they didn't know where it was, and they did find it with LiDAR.
Yeah. But it just...
That's my understanding
to
anyway.
me, it's always been kind of more research-based, not, ooh, let's go find this cool thing for the glory of finding the cool thing.
I mean, an example of one I heard that was neat is this was a Mexican-American war battlefield, and there are supposedly some earthworks on the battlefield. You looked at it, now you couldn't see a dang thing. They send a LiDAR over it, and boop, there it is.
Yeah.
Segments of old trails and roads are clear as day. Even if they look obliterated, you can see them. It's amazing.
Yeah, it's a fantastic technology.
Yes.
And its uses in archaeology are...
It's becoming very common with drones being able to handle them now, smaller drones and smaller pucks.
And, it has a lot of research potential, but... Archaeology is the study of past people. So it's important that if there are descendants, indigenous people, or anything like that, that we communicate and work with them as well. So we can't let this technology kind of steer us away from that, I think. I think that's something that we all, as we utilize this technology, have to keep in mind.
Well, I hope people who are trained in the discipline won't.
Right.
But when we got, honestly, amateur hour here, that's exactly what happened.
Yes. And as you will note, thus far, I don't know that there's been any mention of an archaeologist.
Consulted with one.
Okay. We got one archeologist.
The one that you were surprised was a Mayanist.
Yes. Okay. Gordon Willey.
I think that might have been it.
Yes.
At least by name. But now we've got a couple more. But so definitely not very present here.
We just have looters and drug traffickers.
And rich guys.
Yes.
So Elkins is in love with LiDAR, but he's not sure he wants to go through all the permitting stuff in Honduras again.
That's right, yes.
Which is potentially fair. Like, I mean, you have to do it to do the thing, but if it's not worth it to you, then okay, that's fine. It's your life, and it sounded like it could have been quite a hassle. But then they get lucky, and just about that time, our good friend Bruce Haneke gives him a call. Everyone's favorite.
Fixer? I don't know what you... Bully,
murderer? Because, I mean, according to his stories. Anyway, gives him a call, and I had a little mini rant here. They had left Honduras because of the violence, and his wife went back for a funeral, and the book says Honduras was recovering from a recent coup. And I didn't look into the actual news on this situation, but as it is described in the book, this is not a coup.
Right. Agreed.
So there was a president. It's only a one-term president. This president tried to get the courts to let him do a second term. The court said no. He said, well, I'm going to do it anyway. And then the Congress ordered the military to grab him and deport him from the country. And then the military immediately gave up power to the civilian government. That is a legal... It would have been a coup if he kept power.
Right, yeah.
They went through the legal processes as far as it's presented here, right?
And
I'm sure there's a lot more going on, but that is not how I understand a coup to work. Let us know if there's some nuance we're missing from this that you know about this, or if you are an expert in this kind of thing, because maybe it does fall in that definition technically or some way. I don't understand, but it's just not my understanding. Drove me up the wall.
Yeah, I had the same thought. I actually wanted to talk to you because I was like, was there something I'm missing? But you seem to have the same perspective as I do. So
at this funeral, Heineke's wife, who is the second named woman in this book, but I actually neglected, ironically, to write down her name.
I think it's Mabel, right?
I think that's right. Yeah. Yes. Actually managed to get close to the new president of Honduras and convinces him to basically fast track the project.
And the whole way that story is told, I'm just like, I wonder if that's how it actually happened. It just seemed...
I mean, it came from Heineke, frankly.
Right.
I don't it's fair to not trust anything he says, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, and I think they're actually telling this story while having a drink or cigars or something. So it strikes me as just kind of like good old boy conversation almost. I don't know what you would call it. So I was like, I wonder how factual this story is.
Anyway, seems like they're going to get... And actually, interestingly, Elkins doesn't believe him at first.
Yeah, that's true.
And actually, they have to get one of the cabinet members to give him a call. But I think what the president is looking for is like a win for the country and for probably his presidency. You know, something to kind of get people excited about their history and everything.
Yeah.
Look at the cool stuff this government's doing now. I suspect that's what it is. And, fair enough, kind of. I don't fully understand their situation.
Especially after the not a coup.
The not a coup. And I'm sure there's a lot of tension and such still. And yeah. So now Elkins apparently seems like he can get permits to do LiDAR, and now he needs to get the equipment. So he goes to the National Center for Airborne Laser Mapping, which did the survey in Caracol, and he's trying to get them on board, which they're a little reluctant to at first because it's, a shot in the dark rather than like a known site. Is it going to be worth their time and the money? He wins the director around by showing him the radar images, basically. And Here's a fair bit of stuff that's a little bit sus as well. So the author refers to the radar images as the director was impressed that they got NASA's support.
Which...
they hired him on the side to do this.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, that's very valid.
I guess at the very least a deception.
Right.
At least implied deception. And convinced him basically there was enough to give it a go. And he decided, okay, so we've never done anything in places this thick. Let's go ahead and see if it'll work. It'll be experimental, which honestly is not inherently a bad approach.
No, I mean, you don't know until you know, right?
Right. And so for folks at home, I guess we never really said how LiDAR works. It works like radar or sonar. It sends light beams and it measures how long it takes for the light beams to come back. Important detail is that it actually cannot see through the canopy. What it can do is even when you're in the jungles, you will still see pinpoints of light. And so it can actually get beams of light through there to measure what's underneath.
Yeah, I guess it has a density of light that enough light will get through those little tiny pinholes, which I didn't know because the way it had always been described to me was, it can go through trees.
It can see through the canopy.
So this was new information to me.
And which is accurate too. I had looked this up before. Like, okay, that actually is how it works.
Yeah.
So when you have thick canopy, you have much reduced resolution, I guess you can think of it.
Right, yeah.
As opposed to like when they were working with deserts and they could see 15 feet underground, which is amazing also. But we're not going to get on that again. So he brings him around though, and other people on the team, I guess, were not as eager. They were concerned about the tech being able to function, which he made the kind of potentially valid point that, well, we won't know until we try.
Right.
Other people apparently objected because there were no archaeologists on the project.
Which is valid to me.
It is valid, and then the author doesn't actually address that.
Yeah.
They address the technical argument. They just kind of let the archaeologist argument drop, which I'm not wild about.
I'm not wild about it, and I just don't know why you wouldn't address it.
And why wouldn't a scientific institution like this insist?
That's my thing, too. I was surprised they ended up going along with it.
That should be a condition of them doing this.
Right, because a lot of, I guess this is funded by Elkin.
Right, and private investors.
Yeah, but if it was funded by a state or a federal entity or a government, they would almost certainly insist on having an archaeologist for this.
Well, even if Elkin is funding it, it's still a government-funded program.
Yeah, that's
right?
true.
Even if he's paying for them to be there, like everything that built this is built by public funding.
And some of them, they were concerned because of the reputation of their organization.
Yep.
Which is valid. And if that's a concern, having an archaeologist on staff is a really easy way to address that.
It at least would help.
Yeah.
You can find an ethical archaeologist too, so it's not perfect.
True.
But
that's true.
So every once in a while, I will see a phrasing from the author that makes me think that maybe he's aware of some of the problematic implications of some of the stuff he's talking about.
Do you have an example?
Yes. So here's a quote. A century of archaeology in Mosquito had produced few answers, and much that had been done was limited, superficial, and of poor quality. Archaeologists had not been able to answer some of the most basic questions of this culture: who they were, where they came from, how they lived, and what happened to them. Without doubt, Mosquito harbored many, many undiscovered sites that would yield essential secrets. So it almost feels like he's getting it a little bit and then misses it in the last sentence again. And there's been some other ones where he seems like he's being very specific that there are scientifically undocumented sites. He uses that phrasing at least once.
Oh, yep, you're right.
And so I'm like, I feel like he gets it. Oh yeah, with no record of human entry, they were blank, unknown to science. And so I can't quite tell if he gets it a little bit or if he gets that he should get it. I don't know quite how he has this phrasing sometimes, but then seems to kind of miss the core ideas around it so often.
Yeah, no, that's a valid point, and it seems almost off-brand.
Right. It's just a little contradictory.
Yeah.
Or like maybe an editor said, you need to work on your phrasing here. I mean, it could have been an editing even, and that would explain some of that. I don't know what's going on here, but it's almost a little frustrating that there's little hints to some of this that it just doesn't quite meet the rest of the book. Anyway, they looked at recent data, and so they had 4 target spots they called T1 through T4, and they saw T4 satellite had illegal clear cutting going on, which they assumed also was associated with looting, so they didn't want that anymore.
Yeah, the correlation with clear cutting and looting, as an archaeologist, I was like, ooh, tell me more, because I'm always...
Or establish that claim, please.
Yeah.
I could believe it, but...
I believe it, but I would just like to know...
And then also, it's being looted, so that's a less of a priority?
Right, yeah. I made a note of that too. I was like, so wouldn't that be your first priority if it's potentially going to...
But they're after the prestige and the undiscovered stuff, right?
Right,
That's
so they want something
here.
Pristine.
Right,
but
or what they think is. Anyway.
Yeah, but that to me, that goes to show right then and there that their goal is not in line with what an archaeologist's goal would be.
So in the end, and there's a little side rant about deforestation, but it doesn't get particularly nuanced about the situation and why it's happening and all that stuff. And again, I just felt this really sharply contrasted with Stealing History, which laid out the mechanisms involved in this situation so well.
Yeah.
As opposed to this where we kind of get an airbrush, but nothing of real depth.
And I do want to point out, I'm just thinking about this, some of our criticism is about the author, and some of our criticism is about the expedition
project
itself.
Yeah.
So we're being critical of 2 different...
There's a lot of overlap between the 2 as well, though. So kind of keep that in mind, too.
But I just want, as our listeners kind of listen to this, to think about, there's the story, and then there's the person writing the story, and there's critiques to be had of both.
Yeah. And then the chapter ends with them getting permits for LiDAR in 2010. So chapter 10 starts with Elkins raising money, gets a filmmaker involved. We get information about the filmmaker's grandfather.
I didn't really understand the point of that.
No. And they talk about the documentary they end up doing, it seems. Oh my gosh, this was killing me. So they start in 2012. They convene in Rotan, which is a resort, right? Yes. So they did that because the airport had better security. Valid reason.
Definitely.
Not so valid is that they all had to fully partake in the resort.
Right. This was weird to me.
Weird.
I just, you and I have done a lot of field work. I can't recall ever eating lobster poolside while waiting to get the go-ahead to go into the field.
Oh, that would have been so good. That would have been amazing, because there have been times, I'm sure you've done the same, where we had something lined up and then it fell through and then we just sit and wait. Yeah,
usually I'm eating crackers and tuna.
Or I'm just sitting bored out of my mind because there's nothing to do. This was before cell phones even.
Yeah.
I remember one time that was happening to me so much. One morning, I bored myself awake because I dreamed I was sitting around waiting for work to start.
Oh, God.
It was
That's
awful.
A nightmare.
Oh, it was. It wasn't scary, but it was awful. So yes, this would have been amazing.
Yeah, they're all just kind of, they talk about having a beer by the pool, smoking cigars. What?
And so they're delayed because there's storms in Florida. Go figure.
Right.
And they're getting all antsy because Benison and Elkins were paying thousands of dollars a day for everyone to sit around and waiting. It's well, then don't have everyone stay at a luxury resort. That's your own darn fault. What the hell?
Yeah. And also, I'm sorry you're spending so much of your own money on your little pet project.
Yeah.
I don't really have a lot of
Boo-hoo,
sympathy.
yeah. Oh, boy.
Enjoy your lobsters, dudes.
So we have 3 LiDAR engineers. Dr. Juan Carlos Fernandez Diaz is particularly notable because he was actually born in Honduras, but that he makes a point to show that that's an accident. They didn't have him there because of his heritage or because of his cultural knowledge. No, he just happened to be from Honduras originally.
Right.
We don't hear about his grandfather. But he is also, I think, technically you can say the 4th named Honduras person in the book so far.
Right. I think so, yes.
Because the president, cabinet member, Mabel, and this guy.
Yeah.
A couple other, one of them, which is skeptical of the project, I think, again, rightly so. And the resort didn't help the situation, again, rightly so. And I will get to this, but when he's like, he's convinced, the skeptic has been convinced, drove me up the wall.
Yeah.
I did not care for the framing of that.
You and I had like a long when we were talking about frauds, myth, and mysteries. We were talking about skeptic and how it's misused so often, and being a skeptic isn't a bad thing. And then being like, oh, we've convinced the skeptic kind of has.
Like, we've proven we were right to this person who should have known we were right.
Exactly. And
he was right to be skeptical.
Right.
I'm still a little skeptical.
And it's okay to be skeptical.
Right.
It's not bad. It's actually healthy. And a certain amount of skepticism, especially in this case, is warranted.
Actually, we didn't mention this, but another thing in Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries that came up a lot was the plan to how to create
a good fraud.
Yeah, I think you could apply that very nicely to a lot of the previous parts of this book, actually, with some of those guys, because some of them were clearly too lucky.
Yes.
And some of them seemed to know when to stop or had to stop. Like, this is interesting.
Yeah.
We have a film crew. Bruce is back.
Of course.
And so they apparently, oh my gosh, he would tell the author all kinds of stories, and apparently the author seemed to like seek him out for these stories.
I know, and it got kind of gross to me. Like, Bruce Heinecke is not a person to be revered.
No.
And he just becomes this like interesting character, and I don't like it.
No, he's explicitly forbidden from telling these stories, and then he eventually gets him to admit that he can tell these stories when he's dead.
Right.
Which apparently has happened, so he's allowed to tell these stories.
Yeah, I put, why are we putting Heinecke on a pedestal? He's trash.
I despise this person. Like, oh my goodness. Anyway, they're getting ready to start the survey and they had to put up 3 GPS units.
I do want to point out, every single person sitting at this resort, none of them are archaeologists.
None of them are archaeologists. Most of them are not professionals. Well, I guess you could say Heinecke is a sort of professional, but not the kind of professional you know I mean.
Right. Not the legitimate professional.
Yeah, so starting to get the survey ready, they had to put up 3 GPS units, and there's a whole thing about where they put them, which frankly didn't seem, maybe that'll come to be useful later.
Yeah, the only connection I made is when they started talking about like triangulation and how important it was for...
But there was a whole thing about the 3rd one had to be put near a town and kind of risky because people might know what they're doing. And...
Yeah, which again, I'm like, they probably don't care.
And unless like it comes back and someone finds out and has stolen that GPS unit, this was an entirely useless story.
Well, I think it was just adding to the
mystique.
The
danger.
Yeah.
Which, yeah, if that's all it was, I don't have patience for it. If it actually has a narrative beat where it comes back around and it's a problem later, which we might find out if it is or not, then I could potentially have a little more patience for it, I guess.
Yeah, agreed.
We'll see.
Oh, you know what else I thought was really interesting is they had to come up with their like cover story for the locals.
Yeah.
So that, again, wanting to keep it secret. And to me, that just shows such a lack of trust and such a us versus them mentality.
Yeah.
And again, if this was a true archaeological investigation, you can't have that mentality. You're studying their ancestors. You're studying in their country, in their place where they live.
It's their heritage.
Yes. And it's just so weird to me. It really, really bothers me. And not only is there absolutely no trust, but they didn't even hire any locals. You know, that the Honduran is...
Not until the soldiers.
Right. Yeah, not until the soldiers. And yeah, I have a lot of issues with that.
Yes, agreed on all points. I do want to go back because we stop talking about Heineke for a minute, then talk about the GPS units, then go back to more of Heineke's stories. And so just an overview of these stories. He openly talks about looting grave sites, smuggling artifacts into the States. There's zero conversation in his book about the greater ethics of any of this.
Well, and again, no trust of the locals, but you bring in looters.
Yeah. He won't name the auction house that bought their stolen and smuggled goods.
That's true, yes.
Which the author should be naming them. That's kind of his, I feel like.
Yeah, as
He's
a journalist.
allowed to do that at this point.
Yeah.
You should be doing that.
Yeah.
One site in particular just had a lot of parallels with all of the problems fully laid out in stealing history. And that's one of the reasons I recommend everyone listen to that before getting into this. Because they're running around looting, they stumble across a whole bunch of stuff, and it's all descriptions about how they steal it and smuggle it. It's just gross. If it's true, right? Which is always in the back of my mind is part of the question. There's a story of him cooking food, and a jaguar charges him and he shoots it a whole bunch before it hits him and it dies. And he felt bad about killing the jaguar. And there's other stories about...
Which I thought was so weird because he has no problem threatening a person with a gun.
Not only threatening, according to his stories, murdering people. Like straight up like I had a drug deal and these guys were suspect and we pulled guns and I killed 3 people. And he doesn't feel any remorse for killing those people. But a jaguar trying to kill him, he does.
Yeah. Well, and another thing I got is the very last sentence in this chapter where he's talking about how at one point he got shot and he was trying to get out alive essentially, and he had to get a private plane, and this was in a certain area in Honduras, and he said, after that, I avoided that area up the Rio Patuca like the plague. Life has no meaning up there.
Yeah.
It was like, there are obviously a whole bunch of people living in that area, and by association, you're dehumanizing them.
Yeah.
And I was just like, ugh, this guy.
And repeating those stories without context or critique. Again, that's true. Keep that in mind too. I kept reading this like, I don't know how much of this to believe. Like, he is definitely an unreliable narrator.
Right.
It doesn't make me dislike him any less.
Definitely not.
So, I literally have in my notes, this guy. Last chapter for this episode. So the plane finally arrives and it lands, and there's a whole thing about it being escorted by Honduras soldiers who are not ever named.
Right.
Just, the trend, but I want to point that out. There's a whole thing about this LiDAR being secret military hardware, which I suppose could be true for high-powered LiDAR at that time.
Yeah,
I'm sure it's true. I don't think he's lying about this.
I know, LiDAR is definitely used in the military, and they talk a little bit about that.
Yeah.
And I don't know enough about different types of LiDAR and what would be considered classified, what wouldn't, and what they would be using on this project. But I'll take this at face value.
Yeah. And this was 12 years ago, too.
Yeah.
LiDAR has changed pretty dramatically since, to the point where it's just a little puck that can go on a drone now. Yeah, and I'm sure there are still military LiDARs and stuff out there.
Sure.
He talks more about this LiDAR technology been used for the moon and Mars exploration, which I think is very cool. I like space stuff. Nerd, definitely. Yeah, and then this is where he goes into some more detail about how it works, but I kind of covered that because it felt like it was needed a little earlier almost.
Yeah, and like I said earlier, the kind of how you have to track the plane's movements very precisely to get an accurate map, and it was fascinating to me. If you like the tech, this chapter is kind of good chapter to get more detailed tech.
There's probably better sources overall, but it gives you some more. And it isn't like super detailed, but just a general idea.
I was just excited that we were finally getting to the tech.
Yeah. I found it, did you get this sense? It felt like they were often talking about this LiDAR as if it's the only one in the world.
Yeah.
It was I wasn't quite sure what to make of that. If it's just trying to make it more dramatic or if they meant LiDAR of this kind. And it could be simply my kind of modern perspective on this is its LiDAR is practically everywhere. It's no big deal.
Right. My feeling was at the time, it was just, you know how technology is. It's more expensive when it first shows up and there's not as many of them. And so having more protections in place and think of it more as like a precious item, I can see, especially, this was a while ago now.
Yeah. So of all my critiques of this book so far, this is the most minor one, but I thought it was kind of funny still because it stood out to me. He says at one point in the book that the resolution can get down to an inch.
Oh.
I'm sure it's in imperial units. Yes, please. I'm sure it's imperial units. I thought that was kind of funny. Not a big deal.
I didn't even pick up on that, but as soon as you said it, I was like, oh.
Oh, shoot.
It's written for people who probably are more
I
familiar
know.
with
And like I said,
inches.
of all the criticisms, that's not even hardly worth mentioning. I just thought it was a little funny that I noticed it.
Again, nerd.
I'm
I
in good
call
company.
him a nerd, but I'm a nerd too, guys.
Yeah.
I did like the description of the plane
Yeah.
because they were at this fancy resort chowing down on lobster and smoking cigars and beer and whatever. And then the Cessna shows up and there's oil leaks and it's held together with duct tape inside. And I was just like, this is legitimate scientific equipment.
And this is a government program, 100%. This rickety looking plane is carrying millions of dollars of equipment.
I was like, this is accurate. Yes. This is more like what I'm used to.
I liked the one of the people attending the LiDAR said, the author asked about the oil leak at one point, and the guy said, no, we just have to top it up every time. It doesn't drain fast enough for it to be a problem while we fly. Oh, great. That's fantastic. I don't know if he was messing with him, but I still appreciated it.
Yep.
So the first LiDAR flight they're going to do is for T1, and it's a 3 days to map plan. And on the 4th day, they should know if there's anything there. First day, all they can say is the data's looking good. The second day, they come back, and one of the people that was on the plane attending the LiDAR took a photo of something they thought looked fishy, but it's pixelated. It's not a great image, but it's enough to get people kind of excited.
Yeah, and this was actually a photograph, not a LiDAR picture or something. It was through the window of the plane.
Yeah. So the author basically begs to go on the 3rd day, which this was kind of funny how this goes, because they were not into that at first, but then they had to clear out some things for him, and his space was not, it sounded very uncomfortable.
Kind of crouched in a corner, it sounds like.
Yeah, and there's one point, go ahead.
No, go ahead. You can tell the story. I just thought it was funny.
There's one point where he tried to shift his legs for comfort or something, and he accidentally turned off the LiDAR, which also turned off I think the
GPS location of the plane, or the navigation
of
yeah.
the plane at the same time, which that's ridiculous.
Yeah, because they had to be very precise. They were kind of they called it a lawnmower pattern, back and forth, back and forth.
Which is something we do a lot in archaeology.
Yeah, so navigation was really important, and they're just it's okay, we got this, and they just turned it back on. But I guess he was well, all went smooth, we did great, except for this one time when I accidentally turned the whole system off.
I appreciated his description of the skill it took to pilot this thing.
Yeah.
Because that really made an impression on me.
Yeah, because not only are you having to follow that pattern, but you also have to keep the same distance from the ground, and this is a topographical...
Go slow.
Yeah.
And you have air currents, and you can't deviate from the line of your path too much, or it'll mess up the data. And it goes on for 8 hours, they said. Yeah.
Because he said there's no bathroom. If you need to go to the bathroom, you just go in your pants.
Yep.
Oh, this sounds lovely.
Yep.
No AC.
No AC. Sounds like scientific equipment.
Yes.
And then it gets a little, again, questionable decisions being made at one point. They finished and had some fuel left, so they kind of did some sightseeing. And then they overestimated how much fuel they had, and they had to land it in some random unsecured airport, basically. And the airport didn't have any fuel on hand. And so they landed this multi-million-dollar piece of equipment in a random airport, and it's supposed to be under guard when it's in an airport, by soldiers. So I feel like some management should have had some questions about how that happened.
Yeah, and I guess there wasn't fuel at a lot of the airports. Only certain airports were allowed to have fuel because of narco trafficking. It was under high security, I guess.
Yeah.
And so knowing that, you would think you would plan accordingly and either in an emergency know where the other airports in the area were that had fuel that you could land at because you are in a rickety plane, or know that we have to get back. We have no other choice. And I guess at one point, when they landed at this airport, they thought briefly about going to the near Air Force Base and being like, hey guys, can you come guard our plane?
Right.
And I just would love to know what the Air Force would have said to that. Are you serious?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know.
I wonder what Bruce would have done there.
Yeah.
But I guess they figured it out and they were safe. But
Yeah.
it just seems...
Well, here's an interesting moment, I thought. They decide to send the author back with the data because they can't just upload the data. They have to put it on a USB stick and then manually take it to places because there's not enough internet connection for it. And based on his description, you'd think, oh, well, I hope he makes it back okay. You know, like hitchhiking or whatever
Right.
to get back he's doing. There's no description of the trip back and how he managed that.
Which
or
I thought was really weird because this book seems to be all about the like adventure.
Especially on building up how dangerous it was all over the place.
I was expecting something to go wrong.
I was expecting at least some description of like all the things that could go wrong.
Right. Yeah.
And there wasn't any of that. Yeah, it's kind of interesting.
But they do get the data back.
They got the data back.
And it turns out, well, the description of how they were processing the data and was just kind of funny to me.
Yeah.
Like everybody's kind of sitting around and the one guy that does process the data is processing it, takes forever and forever. And then they send it to another guy to look at. And it just, for all this like buildup and like we want to find things, nobody seems interested in the data.
Or even looking at the initial results of the data.
Right.
Like that should be like, hey guys, it's done. Come on in or something, right? Or
it's so weird to me. I mean, wouldn't you be like waiting around by your computer, like, okay, let's do this. Let's see what we got. Like it was kind of, maybe it's the effect of hanging out at a resort for too long. I don't know.
Maybe that's why we don't get to do that in archaeology very much. Yes, but the guy who was processing the data is the one that announced it, and he's a skeptic no longer. Hooray!
Right, yes.
He's been converted.
And I do love that this is the point at which they send the data to an archaeologist. It's weird to me that they didn't have an archaeologist
on hand
there.
Yeah.
I mean, as the director of the museum, so at least it seems like a legitimate practicing archaeologist.
Right.
But wouldn't it just, I mean, I feel like archaeologists deserve to hang out at a resort. I'm really salty about this. I don't know if you can tell.
Or at least an archaeologist deserves to. So then they're going to go do the rest of the recording, but they have some problems. A part breaks.
Yes.
And the part is made in Canada, and there's like 2 in the world, and it's on a Sunday, and they have to fly it down from Canada, and then the bag gets lost on the way.
Yes. Again.
While they're trying to figure out where the bags went, because, that's a $100,000 part or something, it just arrives. And then Virgilio Paredes and Steve Elkins, I'll just do Paredes and Elkins, went to the airport to get the bags through customs. And again, in quote, he did a masterful job of intimidation, waving around the president's official card. And just like, intimidation doesn't strike me as an admirable thing, even if it's just like political intimidation.
Well, and it wasn't really necessary, I don't think. Like,
I mean, you could have let it go through customs.
Right. Yeah. Like,
and I'm sure, I mean, I'm not saying I'm sure, but the way it's presented, there's going to be bribes and stuff maybe you have to do to make it happen at all. But I don't know, intimidation, I don't know, just doesn't, on top of other things here, it just doesn't sit right.
He's portrayed as a hero.
Well, this wasn't Bruce.
No,
Heineken.
that's true.
This was 2 other guys, but still.
Yeah, but it's
a trend.
Fair. Yeah. To me, it's kind of your lack of planning is not everybody else's emergency. You might just have to wait for your piece of equipment. Right. I'm sorry. That's just the way the world works.
And
sometimes.
I wouldn't say this particular situation was necessarily their lack of planning, but it's still not everyone else's emergency.
Right. Yeah.
Anyway, chapter kind of wraps up. They do T3 next, and it has even more ruins than T1, and they do T2, but that's less certain.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of all I have for the section we're reading. Any other thoughts before we close up, Barbara?
No, I'm just very curious to read more and see if my opinion changes. But having read the reviews that we've read and some of the other articles and critiques pertaining to this project and other related projects, I'm skeptical.
I would love it if there was like a turnaround later and I was like, hey, I realized there's these shortcomings in the way I was thinking about this before, but I want to present it as I was at the time or something like that would be so cool.
Yeah.
I'm not expecting that, unfortunately.
I know. And I wanted to like this book. I was so excited about this book, but there's just so many red flags for me that when I'm not enjoying reading this book in some ways just because it makes me, I have a lot of criticism. Yeah. But also I am enjoying it because it is a good story.
There are elements of it that I'm enjoying.
Yeah. I guess I was just expecting something else.
Well, and like I've said before, when you hold this up in contrast with some of the other books we've read, it's just really clear the shortcomings of this one in particular so far.
Yeah. And I'm not familiar enough with any more of Preston's work. I know I've seen his books like on library shelves and things like that, but I did look into him a little bit, and he's written for the Smithsonian and for the New Yorker. And so I know he is a legitimate journalist, and I just wanted, I guess, a little bit more in-depth research and maybe some critiques of what was happening or some of his own personal...
It doesn't feel like a modern book.
Yeah.
Right? It feels like we were saying, it feels like a throwback to like the 1900s story of exploring strange and dangerous places rather than like making these strange and dangerous places like human.
And if that was his inspiration, if that would have been laid out in the book in some way, I think I could have gotten behind it with that expectation.
Expected it, yeah. When it's presented as something else, though. It's presented as something other than that, though.
Right, yeah. So I don't know. Yeah, we'll see. I mean, I'm hoping for some positive characters and a little less bullying.
Right.
For our next episode, we will be diving into the second portion of this book. We will be reading chapter 12 through 20.
Okay. That's about the second third, I think.
Yes. Yeah. It's about 100 or so pages, give or take a few pages.
Okay. Well, I think that wraps us up for this time. And even though we may not be enjoying this book as much as we hoped for, we certainly enjoyed doing this podcast, and we hope you all have enjoyed listening. We'll see you next time.
Happy reading, everybody.
Archaeology Books for Fun is brought to you by the Florida Public Archaeology Network, a program of the University of West Florida. You can find out more about archaeology and about FPAN at fpan.us. We appreciate any feedback, so if you're listening to us as a podcast, please leave us a review, and if you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. Thanks for listening.